Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Los Palomos Wash Process Colombia from Market Lane Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Market Lane, based out of Melbourne, Australia. And they were a suggestion to us by Alex Truong123. So shout outs to and thank you to Alex Truong123 for the suggestion. Also a major shout out and thank you to our good buddy Zach, as he was nice enough to send us this bag of coffee. And as you can see from the bag, this is a limited release coffee, and that is because it is of the Chirroso variety, which is a variety we've been trying to review as frequently as we can this year. So that makes this an ideal first coffee to review from Market Lane, and I'm looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 33. And recipe we went with for this coffee was similar to our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at slightly cooler temperatures, opting for 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this one, it did come out a lot more developed than I think I was expecting going into it. If somebody asked me if this was closer to a light or medium, I'd actually say it's a little closer to a medium. So by that metric, I would say that it's a little bit more in line with a developed side of a light medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression, and the coffee did have some moderately candied sweetness right at the forefront, as there was a bit of brightness, but it was demonstrating some really nice balances. The first thing I experienced was some dark berry brightness, and in addition to that, a slight savory aspect to the cup as well, very reminiscent of a Kenyan coffee. So it did leave a positive first impression, as the majority of it felt a little bit more balanced, with the exception of a slight bit of brightness to kind of contrast all of that balance. Day 19, ran it through the Chemex, and the coffee is anything but overly defined right off the brew, as it does cool down exceptionally well into what I felt was a little bit more complex of a cup. So there were some slight Kenyan-like characteristics, most notably thinking of that tart berry. However, in addition to that, there was a slightly candied aspect to the cup as well, with a wonderfully sweet citric component to it. So there was a little bit of depth. This was a better day of the coffee. The Chemex really did seem to give it a little bit more depth in general. We continue on to day 21, as the cup does continue to remain very interesting, as there was a lack of very strong brightness. So I've kind of highlighted the brightness on the earlier days, and I think one of the main reasons for highlighting that brightness is because the rest of the coffee felt a little bit more neutral and a little bit more balanced. So the brightness was sticking out as the one thing. However, the strong brightness didn't seem quite as pronounced on this day, as it's still offering many of these sweeter berry-like characteristics, with a heightened focus on those. A slight bit of this caramel and chocolate-like aspect as well, very much in line with what you would expect from a standard washed South American coffee. So a lot of these experiences were somewhat not necessarily what I was expecting, especially from some earlier days. We continue on to day 23, and I ran it through the April brewer for the first time, and it continues to offer a lot of these Kenyan-like characteristics with a little bit of an extended bright finish through this brew method. And that was a little interesting to me. But it continues to feel really balanced, as there was just a lot more of that balanced aspect to it, just neutral for the most part. Day 25. The cup at this point had become a little bit more one-dimensional, as there wasn't a particularly strong focus outside of the brightness. It continued to feel at this time on the more slightly smoky side of things, and that's what I was attributing to this development in terms of the profile of this coffee, as there was some smokiness on the earlier days, but I think I was just kind of waiting for that to maybe settle off. And the more I let this coffee rest, the more smokiness I was getting from it. So it seemed to kind of be on a downward trajectory from pretty early on drinking this coffee. Continues to focus on the more dark berry aspects, so it's just another okay day. Day 27, I have a lot of notes for these next couple of days, but day 27, it was much better this time around through the Chemex, as there's a little bit more complexity through this brew method. And that's one of the main reasons I preferred this brew method, and something I highlighted on the earlier days, as it's slightly herbal, continues to be reminiscent of Kenyan coffees, has a little bit more vibrancy as well, as it's slightly sweeter, with the listed orange the most pronounced it's been to this point. And they only have two notes that I can tell right now. I think it's a black currant and an orange that was on here. However, it had a lot of Kenyan-like characteristics to it in terms of the slightly more savory things. But in addition to that, it had a lot of traditional South American characteristics to it as well. Thinking a lot of the chocolate, thinking a fair bit of the caramel. And then in addition to that, there was a slight smokiness that was present as well. But I think there were enough positives to take away from this day that the smokiness I was experiencing was a little bit more neutralized. Day 29, possibly the best the coffee has been in terms of the slightly more moderate sense, as the overall vibrancy continues to skew on the Kenyan side of things, but it continues to remain just kind of more moderate, and I think that was diluting a little bit, so it was giving the cup even more balance to it, and that was nice in the sense that it didn't have a very strong focus on what was maybe a little bit more savory Kenyan side of things. In addition to that, it was encompassed yet again by a slight roasty quality. Caramel and chocolate continue to be present as well. So while it's the best day in terms of the overall, I would say, balance, it wasn't necessarily my favorite day, as I really liked the way it was on the Chemex through day 27. Day 31, final notes, lowered the temperatures, and it has slightly revitalized the cup, and that's one of the main reasons I like the temperatures a little lower, was because it did kind of tone down what I was experiencing to be a little bit of that smoky kind of roasty quality to the cup. But it still maintained a little bit of the vibrant aspects to it, and that was a really nice positive to it, given that the two things I was trying to avoid from this was a lot of the bright savory aspects and at the same time some smoky aspects that I was experiencing that took away from what I found to be an otherwise nice candied brightness to the cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have a couple of level 4s, about 4 of them, so let's go through those real quick. The cleanliness level 4. Truth be told, it's probably on the slightly lower side of the level 4. I could have bumped it all the way down to a level 3. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, given that it wasn't overly defined to begin with. And in addition to that, it did have some slightly savory characteristics, some slightly smoky characteristics as well. And I think those are kind of the biggest takeaways I had from it. But even then, I couldn't necessarily punish it too much, being in line with maybe a natural processed Ethiopian coffee that had some fermentiness or some punkiness to it, as this didn't have any of those things. It just maybe lacked an overly defined profile for the duration of drinking it. So level 4, lower side of level 4, definitely seems fair. Finish, level 4. Yes, that's one thing I had to say, was it never really lacked for a finish, even if the finish was also not particularly well defined, as it did have some slight chocolate-like aspects. It did have at least a little bit of brightness to the cup. So those things, I could definitely say level 4 also feels somewhat justified. Berry fruit, level 4. I know it's a little generous on both of these to put them all the way up there at the level 4, but I would say that at its best I was experiencing a fair bit of those tart berry aspects, especially in the earlier days, and I'm probably going to mention that a little bit more towards the end when I kind of give my overall thoughts on it. But berry fruit, lower side on these final days, but I could say there were times where it did justify the level 4 mark. Same thing with the citrus, and when I was getting it at its best, it was a little bit more on the sweeter side of the citric aspects as opposed to the bitter side. So those two things I can see at that mark. Then we have a handful of level 3s, and we'll start with the acidity, which is kind of interesting. It's the first note I took away from this coffee the first time I was trying it, but what I was really thinking of the first time I tried this coffee was it reminds me of a Kenyan coffee without maybe the same sort of really heightened acidity or brightness that's present within Kenyan coffees. So that being said, it is on the level 3 side of things, which is fine by me. I'm fine with acidity always reaching that level 3 mark as opposed to having too much brightness in a cup. Florality, level 3. There is an interesting floral component that I haven't really discussed too much in this review up to this point, but I would say that it may be pushed a little bit more than I've been highlighting up to this point, somewhat in an undefined manner, but I could definitely pull a fair bit of florality to it as well. Chocolate level 3, caramel level 3, I've been mentioning those a fair bit, and that just seems to be a little bit more in line with the origin of this coffee, as it is a washed South American coffee, so I definitely see those reaching that level 3 mark. Body level 2, that could be attributed to the Chemex, as that was my primary brew method for this coffee, and that will tend to push it towards a slightly lighter bodied profile. And then the last thing worth discussing is the sweetness at a level 3. Yes, I think I was hoping for a lot more sweetness from this cup, but no matter what sort of adjustments, even on the earlier days, I feel like a level 3 would have been pushing it. The best I could say on the earlier days was it came out as a very pretty cup of coffee, but at no point was it an overly sweet cup of coffee, even when I was getting the sweeter aspects from this coffee. So I think that this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, and I think one takeaway I had the more and more I drank this coffee was the best was probably on the earlier days, and that might be attributed to the roast profile, because I feel like maybe if I would have started this coffee a little earlier, I found it peaking a little bit towards maybe the day 25-ish range, And that's probably where I would have gotten the best results from this coffee. If I would have been able to get it right on some earlier days, then it's maybe at that point that I would have experienced the best of this coffee. Even then, I think I went into this one with such high expectations that when it didn't reach those standards, that I was maybe a little bit disappointed by it overall, as I'd heard really positive things, not just about this coffee roaster, not just about this specific coffee, but also about this variety. And those are all things that I've mentioned in the past. So I went into it with some really high expectations, and that's not to say that this was by any means a bad coffee. I just think that maybe the best of it was behind it by the time I was able to get this coffee right. So for the most part, it turned out just okay for me. Maybe if I didn't have such great expectations, then I would have enjoyed this coffee a little bit more. It's always going to be a little bit of a sticking point when it doesn't reach above a level 3 in terms of the sweetness for me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it did have some really nice Kenyan characteristics, and that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards, while at the same time somehow maintaining a lower level of the brightness in general. In addition to that, it had some traditional South American characteristics, and it feels like a really good marriage of those two origins, as it has a lot of the traditional South American characteristics while at the same time having some unique flavor profiles of a Kenyan coffee. And at its best, you can get some more of those candied components to it as well. Still offering great clarity, if maybe a little bit more development than I think a lot of people that like lighter coffees enjoy. So kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards, and kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Finca Los Palomos, Wash Process Colombia from Market Lane Coffee. Thank you for watching.